Mysterious places don't stay mysterious by accident. Science has gotten remarkably good at explaining almost everything, and then there are these 10 spots, sitting right out in the open, fully studied by actual experts with actual equipment, who still can't agree on what happened, how, or why. So here are 10 mysterious places on Earth no one can explain. Number 10. The Crooked Forest, Poland. Near the town of Gryfino in northwestern Poland sits a patch of forest where roughly 400 pine trees do something no healthy tree should do. Each trunk grows straight up out of the ground for a few inches, then bends sharply, almost a full 90 degrees, curves sideways for up to 3 meters, and then straightens right back out and continues growing normally toward the sky, all in the same direction, all facing north. The trees were planted sometime around 1930, back when the region was still part of Germany, and whatever caused the bend happened while they were still young saplings. The leading theory is that local foresters deliberately manipulated the trees using stakes or weights, hoping to eventually harvest naturally curved timber for furniture or boat parts, a technique that does have historical precedent elsewhere. But the town of Gryfino was largely destroyed and evacuated during World War II, and whoever actually planted and shaped these trees never left behind records explaining exactly what they were doing or why they abandoned the project. Competing theories range from an unusually heavy snowfall bending the saplings before they hardened, to a passing tank or vehicle crushing them during the war, though neither explanation accounts for why the surrounding trees, planted in the same soil at the same time, all grew perfectly straight. Researchers at a nearby Polish university are now racing to study the original trees before they die of old age, hoping to finally settle a question that's been sitting in plain sight for nearly a century. What makes the mystery especially frustrating is the sheer precision involved. Every single bent tree curves in the same direction, north, and every bend begins at almost exactly the same height above the ground, a level of consistency that rules out most random natural explanations, like wind damage or uneven terrain. Forestry researcher Marcin Kubusz, who's leading a new study into the phenomenon, has said the team plans to examine the internal wood fiber structure of the trees to determine exactly when, in their growth, the bending occurred. Information that could finally narrow down whether the cause was mechanical, environmental, or something else entirely. Local forestry officials have even started planting genetically related saplings nearby, hoping to eventually recreate the bend and, in the process, maybe stumble onto the answer nobody's found in almost 100 years of looking. Number 9. The Baltic Sea Anomaly, Sweden. In June 2011, a Swedish treasure hunting team using sonar equipment to search for shipwrecks in the Baltic Sea spotted something strange sitting on the seafloor about 300 feet down, a large disc-shaped object, roughly 200 feet across, with unusually straight edges and what appeared to be a long, debris-covered trail leading up to it, almost like something had slid into position rather than simply sinking there. The team's leader, Peter Lindberg, described the object's edges as remarkably crisp for something sitting on an otherwise natural seabed, and photos of the sonar readings quickly spread online, fueling comparisons to everything from a sunken UFO to a Nazi-era anti-submarine device. Subsequent dives found the object's surface covered in a strange, sooty material, and divers reported that their electronic equipment repeatedly malfunctioned whenever they got close to it, details that only added fuel to the speculation. Geologists who've reviewed the sonar data have mostly concluded the formation is a natural glacial deposit, the kind of debris left behind by retreating ice sheets thousands of years ago, and similar rock formations have been documented elsewhere in the Baltic. Lindberg and his team, however, have never fully accepted that explanation, and without a full physical excavation, which nobody has funded, the exact composition and origin of the object sitting quietly under the Baltic Sea remains, officially, unconfirmed either way. The team's subsequent expeditions only deepened the confusion rather than resolving it. On a return dive in 2012, the crew reported finding a second, smaller circular object nearby, along with a long trench running roughly 985 feet toward the main formation, as if something heavy had been dragged into position rather than settled there naturally over millennia. Water and rock samples collected from the site were sent to labs for testing, and while some of the results were consistent with ordinary basalt, the team has continued to describe portions of the surface material as resembling something closer to processed metal than raw stone. With Swedish authorities showing little appetite to fund a full-scale excavation of what most scientists already consider a settled geological question, the Baltic Sea anomaly remains exactly what its nickname suggests. Officially explained, unofficially still argued about, sitting quietly on the seafloor while both sides continue to disagree over the exact same set of photographs. Number 8. The Longyou Caves, China. In 1992, 4 farmers in Longyou County, in China's Zhejiang province, decided to drain a cluster of ponds that local legend had always described as bottomless. What they found underneath wasn't water at all the way down. It was a series of enormous, hand-carved sandstone caverns, some reaching depths of 30 meters, with smooth walls, supporting pillars, and precise chisel marks covering every surface, clearly the product of an enormous, coordinated construction effort. Since that discovery, 24 separate caverns have been identified in the immediate area, covering more than 30,000 square meters combined. Archaeologists estimate the excavation is at least 2,000 years old, based on pottery fragments recovered from the silt inside. But here's the genuinely strange part. There is no historical document, no local legend, no imperial record of any kind that mentions these caves ever being built, used, or even existing at all. Researchers have calculated that removing this much rock by hand would have required roughly 1,000 workers laboring continuously for 6 years, an undertaking on the scale of a major public works project, and yet nobody has ever figured out where all that excavated stone actually went, what tools were used to carve it so precisely, or why a project this massive left absolutely no paper trail behind it. The engineering itself only deepens the puzzle. Many of the caverns share extremely thin dividing walls, in some cases barely a few feet thick, separating chambers that could each hold hundreds of people, and yet none of those walls have ever collapsed or been accidentally punctured, a level of structural precision that modern engineers studying the site have called remarkable for a project undertaken with nothing but hand tools. Every surface inside the caves is covered in evenly spaced parallel chisel marks, arranged so consistently that some researchers have suggested the builders were following a strict, possibly ceremonial technique rather than simply hacking away at the rock. Proposed uses for the caverns have ranged from military storage depots to imperial quarries to secluded religious retreats, but with only a single Ming-era poem offering the barest hint that the caves existed at all, historians studying Longyou are essentially working with almost no written record for one of the largest excavation projects of the ancient world. Only one of the 24 caverns has ever been opened to tourists, chosen specifically because of a set of carved stone reliefs found inside depicting a horse, a fish, and a bird. Images that offer a rare hint of intention behind a project that otherwise reveals almost nothing about the people who built it. Number 7. The Plain of Jars, Laos. Scattered across the highlands of northern Laos sit more than 2,100 massive stone jars, some standing over 3 meters tall and weighing several tons, carved from sandstone, granite, and limestone, and left arranged in clusters across roughly 90 separate sites. Some of the jars have been dated to as far back as the late 2nd millennium BC, making them thousands of years old. And researchers still don't fully agree on who carved them, how they were transported, or exactly what they were originally used for. Excavations conducted since 2016 have found human remains buried around, and sometimes beneath, several of the jar sites, leading most archaeologists to now believe the jars played some role in funerary rituals, possibly serving as vessels where bodies decomposed before secondary burial nearby. But that theory still doesn't explain how ancient builders moved stones weighing up to 10 tons across miles of rugged terrain using nothing but early tools, or why the practice appears to have continued for well over 1,000 years across such a wide area. Making the mystery even harder to solve is the site's more recent history. During the Vietnam War, this region of Laos became the most heavily bombed area in human history. and unexploded cluster munitions still litter the landscape today, meaning archaeologists can only safely excavate a small fraction of the jar sites, leaving most of Laos's strangest ancient mystery quite literally too dangerous to fully dig into. Local folklore has offered its own explanations over the centuries, long before any archaeologist ever showed up with a trowel. One legend describes a king named Kun Cheung, who supposedly ordered the jars carved to brew and store enormous quantities of rice wine, celebrating a hard-won military victory over an enemy kingdom. Another simply describes the jars as drinking vessels abandoned by a race of giants who once roamed the region. Archaeologist Dugald O'Reilly, who has led recent excavation efforts at the site, has described the Plain of Jars as one of the great archaeological mysteries of the world, noting that surprisingly little formal research had been conducted there for decades, mostly due to regional conflict and the sheer difficulty of working safely around unexploded ordnance. A 2016 excavation of just one site suggested the surrounding mortuary population could ultimately number in the thousands, meaning the full scope of what's actually buried among these stone jars may still be almost entirely unknown. Number 6. The Boiling River, Peru. Deep in the Peruvian Amazon, roughly 700 kilometers from the nearest active volcano, runs a stretch of river that genuinely boils. Local communities have known about Shanai Timpishka, which translates roughly to boiled with the heat of the sun, for generations. But most geologists dismissed it as folklore until a Peruvian geothermal scientist named Andres Ruzo, inspired by childhood stories from his grandfather, finally tracked it down and formally studied it starting in 2011. Ruzo measured water temperatures as high as 99 degrees Celsius across a 4-mile stretch of river, hot enough that small animals falling in are cooked almost instantly. The genuinely strange part is the location itself. Standard geothermal science says boiling water like this should only occur near volcanic activity or along a tectonic plate boundary, and this stretch of Amazon rainforest sits nowhere near either one. As Ruzo put it, we're over 700 kilometers away from the nearest active volcanic center in the middle of a sedimentary basin, which by conventional geology shouldn't produce a boiling river at all. The leading explanation involves rainwater seeping unusually deep underground, getting superheated by the Earth's natural internal heat, and then forced back up to the surface through a network of geological faults, essentially functioning like a very long, very hidden kettle. It's a plausible mechanism, but nobody has fully mapped the underground plumbing responsible, meaning the exact reason this particular stretch of ordinary rainforest happens to boil remains, in Ruzo's own words, still being worked out. Before settling on a natural explanation, Ruzo had to rule out something considerably more alarming: that the river's heat came from a botched drilling accident rather than anything geological. The region sits near an active oil field, and Ruzo has pointed to a comparable disaster on the Indonesian island of Java, where a drilling operation accidentally punctured a pressurized geothermal reservoir and triggered a mud volcano that's been erupting continuously for years, displacing tens of thousands of people in the process. Local accounts and historical references to Shanai Timpishka long predate any modern drilling in the area, which effectively ruled out an industrial cause. But the incident underscores just how little separates a genuine natural wonder from a genuine ongoing disaster. The site remains entirely unprotected by any formal conservation status, and with logging steadily encroaching on the surrounding jungle, researchers studying the river's unique heat. Loving microbes are racing against development as much as they're racing to understand the geology itself. Number 5. Movile Cave, Romania. In 1986, Romanian construction workers scouting a site for a new power plant near the Black Sea accidentally drilled into something nobody expected: a cave system that had been completely sealed off from the surface world for an estimated 5.5 million years. Once biologists finally got inside, what they found genuinely rewrote assumptions about how life on Earth can survive. The air inside Movile Cave is toxic to humans, low in oxygen and thick with carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide, the same gas that gives rotten eggs their smell. and yet the cave is teeming with life. Researchers have identified more than 50 invertebrate species living there, the majority found absolutely nowhere else on the planet, including eyeless spiders, a blind leech, and a translucent water scorpion, none of which have ever seen a single ray of sunlight. Rather than relying on photosynthesis like virtually every other ecosystem on Earth, Movile's entire food web runs on chemosynthesis, with bacteria converting sulfur and methane directly into usable energy. Because the ecosystem is so fragile and so completely unlike anything else on the surface, access is severely restricted, and only a small number of scientists have ever been allowed inside. NASA has taken a genuine interest in the site specifically because its chemistry closely resembles conditions scientists expect to find on Mars or on Jupiter's moon Europa, meaning a sealed cave in Romania has become one of the best available stand-ins for studying what alien life might actually look like. Genetic studies conducted on the cave's bacteria have found they share evolutionary traits with microbes discovered around deep-sea hydrothermal vents, organisms that similarly thrive without any sunlight at all, suggesting Movile's isolated ecosystem may have tapped into an ancient survival strategy that predates most complex life on the surface entirely. Researchers who've studied the cave's animal population have also noted a strange pattern. Most species have lost their eyes and their pigmentation entirely over millions of generations spent in total darkness. A textbook example of evolution, stripping away traits an organism simply no longer needs. Exploring the cave itself requires full protective gear, since the combination of low oxygen and high concentrations of toxic gas can be lethal within a matter of hours, and researchers typically limit their visits to just a few hours at a time before having to surface, treating one of the most scientifically important caves on the planet with the same caution they might reserve for an actual alien environment, which, in a sense, is exactly what it is. Number 4. The Tunguska Event Site, Russia. At roughly 7:17 in the morning on June 30th, 1908, something exploded in the sky above a remote stretch of Siberian forest near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River, with force equivalent to somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT, enough to flatten an estimated 80 million trees across more than 2,000 square kilometers. Seismographs as far away as Western Europe registered the shockwave, and for several nights afterward, skies across Europe and Asia glowed unusually bright, bright enough in London to reportedly read a newspaper outdoors at midnight. Nobody actually witnessed the object arrive, and because the area was so remote, the first scientific expedition didn't reach the site until 1927, nearly 2 decades later. That expedition, led by mineralogist Leonid Kulik, found the flattened forest, but no impact crater and no recovered meteorite fragments of any significant size, an absence that's fueled debate ever since. Most scientists today believe the explosion was caused by a relatively small asteroid, somewhere around 50 to 100 meters across, that detonated in the atmosphere before ever reaching the ground, a type of event called an airburst. Others continue to argue for a cometary origin instead, pointing to the glowing night skies as evidence of extra water vapor in the upper atmosphere, a hallmark of comets rather than rocky asteroids. Chemical analysis of resin from the affected trees has turned up traces more consistent with an asteroid, but without a confirmed impactor ever recovered, the debate over exactly what hit Siberia that morning, more than a century later, technically remains open. The absence of any recovered fragments has kept the theorizing genuinely wild over the decades, ranging from a small black hole passing through the planet to a chunk of antimatter annihilating on contact with the atmosphere, ideas that mainstream scientists have generally dismissed, but that persist anyway, simply because nobody's ever found a smoking gun to shut the conversation down for good. One curious lead involves a small lake called Cheko, located about 5 miles from the epicenter, which some researchers have proposed could actually be a water-filled impact crater left by a surviving fragment of whatever exploded overhead. Other geologists studying the same lake have pushed back hard on that idea, arguing its shape and sediment layers look nothing like an impact site, and instead, match a much older, unrelated geological feature. Local Evenki reindeer herders, who lived closest to the blast, reportedly lost more than 1,000 animals in the explosion. And while no confirmed human deaths were ever recorded, the sheer force of an event capable of flattening an area larger than a major city without leaving so much as a crater behind remains one of the strangest unresolved footnotes in the history of Earth impacts. Number 3. The Yonaguni Monument, Japan. In 1986, a local dive guide named Kihachiro Aratake was scouting the waters off Yonaguni Island at the southwestern tip of Japan, looking for a good spot to watch hammerhead sharks, when he came across something startling on the seafloor. A massive terraced rock formation, roughly 25 meters tall, with sharp right angles, flat platforms, and what looked distinctly like carved steps leading toward the surface. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has spent decades studying the site and remains convinced the formations are man-made, pointing to what he describes as deliberately carved holes, straight edges, and even faint symbols resembling ancient script cut into the stone. If he's correct, and if his estimated age of over 10,000 years holds up, the Yonaguni Monument would predate every other known megalithic structure on Earth, including Göbekli Tepe, by a significant margin. Most geologists disagree, arguing that Yonaguni sits in an earthquake-prone region where the local sandstone and mudstone naturally fracture along clean horizontal and vertical planes, a process that can produce sharp angles without any human involvement at all. Geologist Robert Schoch, who's personally dived the site, has described the regularity of the fractures as entirely consistent with natural tectonic stress, rather than deliberate carving. What almost everyone agrees on is one striking fact. Roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today, meaning this exact spot would have stood well above water, a detail that keeps the human construction theory alive, no matter how many geologists push back against it. A more recent study presented at Japan's 2024 Association of Japanese Geographers Conference added further weight to the natural formation camp, arguing that the site's geometric regularity can be explained entirely by how the local rock layers fracture under repeated seismic stress without requiring any human tools at all. Neither Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs nor the Okinawa Prefecture government has ever formally recognized Yonaguni as a protected cultural or archaeological site, a bureaucratic detail that critics of the man-made theory often point to as telling, and supporters dismiss as simple institutional caution. What keeps the debate genuinely alive, rather than settled the way most geological disputes eventually are, is that both sides are looking at exactly the same rock formation and walking away with completely opposite conclusions about what they're seeing. Number 2. Göbekli Tepe, Turkey. Perched on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in circular enclosures and covered in detailed carvings of foxes, boars, scorpions, and birds. What makes the site genuinely paradigm-shifting is its age. Dated to roughly 9,600 BC, Göbekli Tepe was built more than 11,000 years ago, making it over twice as old as Stonehenge, and it was constructed entirely by hunter-gatherers, people who, by every previous assumption in archaeology, weren't supposed to be capable of large-scale monumental construction at all. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who led major excavations starting in 1995, called it the world's oldest temple, and its existence flipped a long-standing assumption in anthropology on its head. Scholars had generally believed farming came first, creating the surplus food and settled populations needed to eventually build temples and organize religion. Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite, that the enormous cooperative effort required to build something like this, requiring hundreds of workers to be fed and organized, may have actually driven early humans toward agriculture and permanent settlement in the first place. Stanford anthropologist Ian Hodder put it bluntly, saying, "Göbekli changes everything." And decades later, researchers still can't fully agree on why hunter-gatherers, with no writing, no metal tools, and no domesticated crops, decided this particular hilltop was worth such an enormous investment of labor. Less than 10% of the site has even been excavated so far, meaning whatever answer eventually emerges is still, quite literally, buried. Even the reason the site survived this long remains genuinely puzzling. At some point centuries after each set of pillars was built, the people using Göbekli Tepe apparently buried their own structures deliberately, filling the circular enclosures with rubble, soil, and tens of thousands of wild animal bones before building an entirely new set of pillars on top. Schmidt originally interpreted this as a ritual act, a deliberate closing ceremony marking the end of one structure's use before a new one began. More recent excavations have complicated that picture further, uncovering hearths, fire pits, and tools suggesting people may have lived at the site far more permanently than Schmidt's original nomadic pilgrimage theory allowed for. Carved into several of the site's most famous pillars are stylized human arms and hands, along with a scattering of detached human skulls bearing deliberate cut marks, evidence some archaeologists interpret as remnants of an early skull cult honoring ancestors, or possibly displaying the remains of defeated rivals, though which explanation is correct remains just as unresolved as everything else about the site. Number 1. The Nazca Lines, Peru. No list like this one ends anywhere else. Etched into more than 170 square miles of Peruvian desert are the Nazca Lines, a sprawling collection of geometric shapes, straight lines stretching for miles, and enormous figures depicting animals and plants, including a hummingbird, a monkey, and a spider, all created by the Nazca culture sometime between roughly 500 BC and 500 AD. The lines are so massive that they're essentially invisible from the ground, and their full scale wasn't properly understood until commercial pilots began flying over the desert in the 1930s. Since their rediscovery, researchers have proposed dozens of competing theories about their purpose. Early studies by Paul Kosak and Maria Reiche argued the lines functioned as a massive astronomical calendar, tracking the movement of the sun, moon, and stars across the desert floor. Later researchers, including Johann Reinhard and Anthony Aveni, made the case that the lines were instead religious walkways, ritual paths used to petition mountain gods for rain in one of the driest places on the entire planet. Others have connected the figures to the Nazca people's pottery designs, or argued the lines point toward underground water sources critical to desert agriculture. Drone surveys in recent years have uncovered more than 50 additional lines nobody had previously mapped, and researchers continue finding new figures on a semi-regular basis, meaning the puzzle keeps getting bigger even as the tools available to study it keep improving. After nearly a century of serious scientific study, archaeologists still can't say with confidence why an ancient civilization spent generations carving enormous artwork into the ground that could only ever be properly seen from the sky. One of the more credible recent theories, proposed by archaeologist Donald Prue and hydrogeologist Stephen Mabey, connects the lines directly to water rather than the heavens, suggesting many of them point toward underground aquifers and the Puquios, an intricate network of ancient spiral wells still visible near the site, that the Nazca people relied on to survive in one of the driest deserts on Earth. That theory sits alongside the older astronomical readings first proposed by Maria Reiche, the German-born mathematician who spent decades of her life single-handedly mapping and preserving the lines, earning her the nickname the Lady of the Lines among locals who watched her camp out in the desert for weeks at a time, chasing an answer she never fully found. With the desert's extreme dryness having preserved the lines almost perfectly for over 1,000 years, and new figures still surfacing under modern drone surveys, the Nazca Lines remain a mystery that keeps expanding even as the technology meant to finally solve it keeps improving. 10 places studied by real scientists using real equipment, and every single one of them still ends the same way, with more questions than answers. From bent trees nobody can explain to a river that boils for no volcanic reason at all, the common thread isn't a lack of research, it's just how much of this planet still refuses to give up a straight answer. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which of these mysteries you think will finally get solved first. See you in the next video.